The lock clicked in a way it never had before, sharp and final, like a word you can't take back. I stood on my own porch with 2 grocery bags cutting into my fingers, staring at a door that no longer recognized me. That was the moment I understood how easy it is to be erased when people decide you're inconvenient. I am 68 years old, and until that afternoon, I believed a house remembered the hands that cared for it. I believed family did, too. My name is Margaret Wilson, and for nearly 40 years I paid the mortgage on that narrow blue house on Linden Street. I scrubbed its floors on my knees, replaced its light fixtures, argued with utility companies over unexplained charges, and mailed property tax checks every November with neat handwriting and a steady sense of duty. My husband, Harold, died 8 years ago from a heart that finally got tired of carrying the weight of his kindness. After the funeral, the house grew quieter in a way that felt physical, like cotton stuffed into the walls. I learned how to be alone without being lonely. I clipped coupons, tracked expenses in a spiral notebook, and lived on my pension and Social Security without complaint. I thought that was what dignity looked like at my age. My son Daniel moved back in 3 years ago after his divorce, bringing with him his teenage daughter, Emily. She was polite at first, all soft apologies and carefully neutral smiles. She called me Mrs. Wilson until Daniel insisted she call me Grandma Maggie. I cooked dinners that stretched further than the recipes intended, paid the water bill when it spiked without explanation, and signed permission slips when Daniel worked late. I told myself this was what family does when one generation stumbles. Over time, the house shifted in small ways. My chair in the living room was moved because it blocked the Wi-Fi signal. My mail was stacked unopened on the side table, mixed with delivery confirmations and bank notices addressed to Daniel. When I mentioned a late electric bill, Emily sighed loudly and said the house was a lot to manage. I started keeping my receipts in a labeled envelope just to be safe. That morning, I had gone out for groceries the way I always did on Thursdays. I used my loyalty card, paid in cash, and chatted briefly with the cashier about the weather turning cold too early. I bought chicken thighs, apples, store-brand cereal, and the kind of bread Daniel liked. I remember that clearly because my hands smelled like paper and fruit when I climbed the porch steps. The new lock gleamed silver, where the old brass one had been. I tried my key twice, slower the second time, as if patience might persuade it. That was when Emily opened the door just enough to speak, her phone glowing in her hand. She told me Daniel agreed it was better this way. She said I was too much work. She said I stressed everyone out. The door closed gently, almost politely. My groceries sat on the porch beside my feet, milk already beginning to sweat through the bag. Somewhere inside, my landline rang, unanswered. I stood there listening to the hum of a house that no longer belonged to me, feeling something settle in my chest. It wasn't anger yet. It was clarity arriving quietly, the way truth often does. My first thought was embarrassingly practical. The milk would spoil, the chicken would turn. Even in shock, my mind went to waste, because I grew up in a time when you didn't throw food away unless you had to. I carried the bags back to my car with my key still warm in my palm, like it had been working a second ago in a different life. I sat behind the steering wheel and stared at my own front window. The curtains were the ones I had sewn when Harold was still alive, the hem a little crooked because he made me laugh while I worked. Now those curtains looked like stage dressing, something pretty meant to hide what was really happening. I called Daniel. It rang until voicemail. I called again. Same result. Then Emily's number, the one I'd only ever used to ask if she wanted me to pick her up from school when the bus was late. She answered on the third ring, and I could hear a television in the background and the thin clink of ice in a glass. Grandma Maggie, she said, like we were still on friendly ground. My groceries are on the porch, I told her. My voice surprised me. It was steady. I need my medication too. The orange bottle in the kitchen cabinet. Top shelf. A pause, then a small exhale, impatient. You'll have to talk to Dad. I am trying, I said. Tell him I'm in the driveway. Tell him I'm not leaving until he speaks to me. Another pause, and then the line went dead. I sat there long enough to watch the porch light flick on, automatically, though the sun was still up. Motion sensor. Something I'd agreed to install because Daniel said it would make everyone feel safer. I realized then that safety can be another word for control, depending on who holds the switch. Across the street, Mrs. Donnelly's blinds shifted. Neighbors notice things. They always have. They don't always intervene. I didn't want pity, and I didn't want an audience for whatever would come next. I started the car and drove to the grocery store again, because I needed cold to become warm and facts to become something I could hold. Inside, the air smelled like oranges and disinfectant. I went straight to customer service and asked for a printed copy of my receipt. The young man behind the counter looked at me with polite confusion until I gave him my loyalty number. He tapped keys, printed paper, and slid it toward me like a small lifeline. Here you go, ma'am. Thank you, I said, and tucked it into my purse. Then I drove to the bank. My bank is the kind that still has tellers who remember your name if you've been coming in long enough. Sheila at the front desk looked up and her expression softened, like she could see something off about my face. Margaret? Honey, are you all right? I need to check something, I said, and I'd like a printout of the last 6 months of transactions on my checking account. Sheila's eyebrows lifted just slightly, but she didn't ask why. That's what I liked about her. She led me to a little desk, offered me water, and brought over the statements with the official logo at the top, clean and undeniable. As I flipped through the pages, my stomach tightened. There were charges I didn't recognize, a streaming service I'd never signed up for, several food delivery orders on nights I'd cooked, 2 transfers marked as online payment, each a few $100s, labeled with an account number that wasn't mine. I had noticed the account dipping lower than usual, but Daniel always said prices were going up, that teenagers ate like wolves, that I shouldn't worry because he'd handle it. I'd wanted to believe him. It had been easier than staring into the possibility that my own son could look at my careful life and see a resource. Sheila, I said quietly, can you tell who these transfers went to? She pulled the page closer, her finger tracing the line. It's linked to an external account. It looks like it was set up with your online banking credentials. I didn't set it up, I said. Her face became professional in an instant, the softness replaced by procedure. Then we need to flag it. I can also have fraud prevention call you. Did anyone have access to your phone or computer? Daniel had helped me set up online banking after Harold died, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open and my password written on a sticky note. He'd said it was safer that way, easier. My son did, I said. The words tasted bitter, but they were true. Sheila nodded slowly, as if she'd seen this kind of story before. Okay, let's start with changing your passwords right now, and we'll put a note on your account. I also recommend you file a police report if you believe money was taken without permission. Police report. The phrase felt heavy, like a door slamming the way mine had. I wasn't ready for that yet. I wasn't ready to say Daniel's name in a place where it would be typed into a system. But I was ready for something else. I was ready to stop being confused. I drove next to my lawyer's office, the same small firm that handled Harold's will. The building smelled like old carpet and fresh coffee. A brass plaque near the door still shined, and for a moment I felt foolish for coming. Like maybe I was overreacting. Like maybe I should go back, knock again, apologize for being too much work, and promise to be smaller. Then I remembered the click of that lock. Sharp. Final. I sat in the waiting area with my purse on my lap, my receipt and bank statements inside like evidence in a case I hadn't known I was building. When Mr. Adler came out, he was older than I remembered, his hair more silver, his eyes still kind but alert. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, "it's been a while." "It has," I replied, and followed him into his office. He listened without interrupting as I told him what happened. The changed locks, the ignored calls, the bank transfers. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't need to. The facts carried their own weight. When I finished, Mr. Adler leaned back and folded his hands. "Whose name is on the deed?" "Mine," I said. My voice grew firmer as I spoke. "Only mine. Daniel was never added." "And the utilities?" he asked. "Mostly mine. A few were switched to Daniel when he said it would help with discounts. But the property taxes, the homeowner's insurance, the mortgage back when there was one, all me." Mr. Adler nodded. "Then legally, they cannot lock you out of your own home. Changing the locks without your consent is not just unkind, it may be unlawful." The word unlawful landed differently than police report. It didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like a boundary drawn in ink. "I don't want anyone hurt," I said quickly. "I don't want drama. I want my life back." Mr. Adler's eyes softened. "You can have that, but you'll need to be willing to be very clear." Outside, the late afternoon light had faded to something pale and wintry. I sat in my car again, but this time my hands weren't shaking. In my purse were documents. In my mind were next steps, not spoken aloud like a list, but settling into place like puzzle pieces. And for the first time since Harold died, I felt something like him beside me. Not his body, not his voice, but his steady belief that I deserved to be treated with respect. That night, I didn't sleep in my bed on Linden Street. I stayed at a modest motel off the highway, the kind with thin blankets and a humming vending machine. I took my blood pressure pill from the spare bottle in my purse, ate crackers for dinner, and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere out there, my son was sitting in my living room as if it were his. My granddaughter was scrolling through her phone as if she hadn't just shut a door on an old woman with groceries. In the dark, I whispered into the quiet, not to God exactly, but to the part of myself I had ignored for too long. No more. By morning, the shock had cooled into something heavier and more deliberate. The motel coffee tasted burnt, but it did its job. I sat at the small desk by the window, spreading my papers out like a quiet confession. Bank statements, the grocery receipt, a folded copy of my property tax bill I always carried, out of habit more than need. When you live long enough, habits become armor. I drove back to Linden Street just after 8 when people were leaving for work, and the neighborhood looked ordinary enough to pretend nothing had happened. Daniel's car was gone. Emily's too. The house stood there calmly, blue siding catching the light, as if it had no idea what it had been used for the day before. I didn't try the door. I didn't knock. I walked around the side and checked the garage keypad. The code had been changed. That hurt more than the lock. Codes are shared things, or at least they used to be. I sat in my car and called the non-emergency police line, my hands steady on the steering wheel. I explained that I was locked out of my own home. I gave my name, my address, and waited while the dispatcher typed. Her voice stayed neutral, professional. She asked if I felt unsafe. I said no. I said I felt displaced. A patrol car arrived 20 minutes later. The officer was young enough to be my grandson, polite in the careful way people are when they don't know where to put their sympathy. I showed him my driver's license. the address matching the house behind us. I handed him a copy of the deed that Mara Adler had emailed me that morning. The officer studied the paper, then looked up at the front door. "You're the sole owner," he said. "Yes," I replied. He knocked, harder than I would have. Emily answered, her confidence slipping the moment she saw the uniform. She said Daniel told her it was handled. The officer asked who authorized the lock change. She said she didn't know. Her voice grew thin, defensive. The locksmith arrived 10 minutes later, called by the officer, not by me. That detail mattered. The officer watched as the old lock was removed, the new one boxed up and labeled. Emily stood back, arms crossed, saying nothing. When the door opened, the house smelled like last night's takeout and the lemon cleaner I favored. Familiar. Mine. I walked in slowly, not out of fear, but out of respect for myself. The officer told Emily she needed to leave if I asked her to. I did. She packed a backpack, eyes flashing between anger and disbelief, and walked out without looking at me. When it was quiet again, I sank into my chair, the one that had been moved for the Wi-Fi. My phone buzzed. Daniel's name lit up the screen. I let it ring. Later that afternoon, I met Mr. Adler again. We talked about formal notices, about documenting everything. He advised me to change all passwords, to open a new checking account, to keep a log of calls and messages. He spoke calmly, as if this were a storm we could map rather than fear. Back at the house, I opened drawers I hadn't checked in months. I found unopened mail addressed to me, bank alerts printed and folded, a credit card offer I'd never seen. On Daniel's old desk, I found a folder with my name written on it, inside copies of my ID I hadn't made. Have you ever felt that strange mix of relief and grief when the truth finally shows itself? When the fog lifts and you realize you weren't imagining the imbalance all along? That evening, I called the utility companies one by one. I transferred accounts back into my name. I requested usage reports. I canceled services I hadn't authorized. Each call took time. Each hold music loop tested my patience. But with every confirmation number written down, I felt myself returning. Daniel came by just after sunset. He stood on the porch, hands raised slightly, like I might accuse him of something violent. He said he was trying to help. He said I was overwhelmed. I told him help doesn't come with locks and silence. I told him he needed to leave and speak to his lawyer if he had something to say. He stared at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time. Then he left. That night, I slept in my own bed. The house creaked the way it always had. I lay there listening, not to remember the past, but to mark the present. I was still here, and this time, I was paying attention. Did you ever realize too late that you were being used? Not out of cruelty, but convenience. The house felt different once I began moving through it with purpose. Not anger, not fear, but intention. I opened windows to let out the stale air, the smell of someone else's choices lingering where mine used to be. I made tea and let it steep longer than usual, watching the steam curl upward like a thought, finding its way free. I spent the morning gathering paper. Deeds, insurance policies, old warranty folders Harold had labeled in block letters. I found the original locksmith receipt from 10 years back, tucked into a drawer with expired coupons. I photographed the new lock's packaging the officer had left behind, the model number clear, the purchase date printed at the bottom. Small things, but small things tell the truth when arranged properly. Daniel texted once, just a sentence. "We need to talk." I didn't answer. Silence can be a boundary, too. Around noon, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. It was the bank's fraud department. The woman on the line spoke gently, but directly. She confirmed the external account receiving my funds belonged to Daniel. She explained the process of provisional credits, affidavits, timelines. I answered each question carefully, sticking to facts. Dates, amounts, access. When she thanked me for my cooperation, I felt an unexpected swell of pride. I was cooperating with myself for once. In the afternoon, I drove to the storage unit Harold and I had rented years ago when we downsized. The air inside smelled like dust and cardboard. I found a box labeled legal, and inside it, a copy of my will, unsigned revisions, and a handwritten note from Harold, reminding me to trust your judgment. I sat on the concrete floor and cried then, quietly, because grief has a way of returning when you finally feel safe enough to let it. By evening, I had changed every password, closed accounts, and opened new ones. I set up alerts that chimed softly on my phone whenever a dollar moved. The sound was reassuring, like a heartbeat you can hear again after a scare. The next day, I met with a mediator recommended by Mr. Adler. Neutral office, beige walls, a box of tissues placed exactly where you'd expect it. Daniel arrived late, jaw tight, eyes tired. He spoke about stress, about responsibility, about how hard it was to manage everything. I listened. When it was my turn, I slid copies of statements across the table. I spoke about consent, about trust, about the difference between help and taking. He didn't look at the papers for a long time. When he did, his shoulders sagged. The mediator explained restitution, repayment plans, legal consequences if we couldn't agree. Daniel nodded, subdued. He agreed to move out within 30 days. He agreed to repay every dollar, documented, scheduled, automatic. When I left, the sky was pale blue, the kind that promises nothing dramatic, just continuity. I drove home slowly, noticing details I'd missed before. The cracked sidewalk slab, the maple tree Harold planted, my mailbox slightly crooked, waiting. That night, I balanced my checkbook the old-fashioned way, pen and paper. The numbers lined up. For the first time in a long while, so did I. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar but honest. I woke early, not because anyone needed me, but because my body remembered mornings. I made oatmeal and read the local paper all the way through, even the parts about zoning meetings and school board votes. It felt grounding to know what was happening in the world beyond my walls again. Daniel moved his things out quietly. He came when I wasn't home, as agreed through the mediator, and left the keys on the kitchen counter. I found them beside a short note written on a receipt from a gas station. It said he was sorry for crossing lines. It didn't ask for forgiveness. I appreciated that restraint more than an apology wrapped in excuses. I spent one afternoon with a clerk at the county records office, updating contact information and requesting certified copies of my deed. The printer hummed steadily, producing documents stamped and signed, official in a way that felt protective. I placed them in a new folder, bright red, impossible to overlook. Visibility, I was learning, is a form of safety. At home, I rearranged the living room. I put my chair back by the window where the light falls just right in the late afternoon. I canceled the streaming services I never watched and reactivated the landline voicemail I preferred. I even replaced the porch light sensor with a manual switch. I wanted to decide when the house woke and slept. Money returned slowly, as scheduled. Each deposit arrived with a notification and a note indicating repayment. I recorded them carefully, not out of bitterness, but accuracy. There is comfort in numbers behaving the way they should. I also began going out more. I joined a weekly walking group at the community center, women my age and older, moving at a pace that allowed conversation. We talked about knee braces, grandchildren, and favorite recipes. No one asked why I had been absent before. They simply made room. One afternoon, a package arrived from the locksmith company. Inside was a refund for the unauthorized lock change. processed after the police report and proof of ownership were reviewed. I held the check for a long moment before depositing it, not because of the amount, but because it represented acknowledgement. Someone had looked at the facts and agreed with me. In the evenings, I wrote. Not letters, not complaints, just pages about my life as I remembered it. Harold's laugh, Daniel as a child, earnest and impatient. Myself, younger, quieter, always accommodating. Writing didn't rewrite the past, but it organized it. It gave shape to what had once felt scattered. The house began to sound like itself again. The radiator clicked, the stairs creaked in the third step. These were not annoyances. They were confirmations. I wasn't rebuilding out of spite. I was restoring something that had been temporarily misused. And with each small, deliberate choice, I felt my footing strengthen. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked neatly between a grocery flyer and a notice from the water company. Daniel's handwriting was careful, almost formal, as if he were afraid his usual slant might betray too much. Inside, he outlined the repayment schedule again, apologized for misjudgments, and asked if we could talk soon. I folded the letter and placed it in the red folder with everything else. Not as evidence this time, but as a marker of distance. Some conversations heal, others only reopen things that are finally scarring over. That same afternoon, I drove downtown for an appointment with the housing authority. Mr. Adler had suggested it gently, explaining that at my age, and given my fixed income, there were programs designed to protect homeowners like me from future coercion or financial abuse. The building was concrete and glass, humming with quiet bureaucracy. I filled out forms, initialed disclosures, and answered questions asked in calm, practiced voices. When the caseworker explained how my home could be placed into a trust under my control, shielded from unauthorized changes, I felt a surprising sense of relief. Protection doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes it means wisdom earned late. On the way home, I stopped at the pharmacy. The pharmacist greeted me by name and asked if I wanted to review my medications again. I said yes. We sat at a small counter, fluorescent lights buzzing softly, and went through each bottle, dosages, refill dates, interactions. I realized how often I had let others handle things like this for me, mistaking delegation for ease. Walking out with a neatly stapled printout, I felt capable in a way I hadn't in years. Emily tried to reach me through social media. A message request appeared one evening, her profile picture updated, her tone tentative. She said she missed me. She said things had been confusing. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I typed a brief response, wishing her well and suggesting she talk to her father. I didn't owe explanations anymore. Boundaries are not punishments. They are clarifications. A few days later, Daniel called again. This time, I answered. We spoke plainly, no raised voices, no dramatics. He acknowledged the bank findings, the mediation terms, the trust paperwork. He asked if I hated him. I told him hate takes more energy than I'm willing to give now. I told him I loved him, but love does not mean access. There was a long silence on the line, heavy but honest. When we hung up, I felt lighter, not because everything was fixed, but because nothing was being hidden. I spent more time at the community center. I signed up for a basic computer safety workshop, learning about password managers and two-factor authentication from a woman half my age who spoke with respectful patience. I practiced setting alerts, recognizing phishing emails, and reviewing account permissions. It felt strange, starting over at 68, but also invigorating. Learning keeps you from shrinking. One afternoon after class, a woman named Ruth invited me for coffee. She had kind eyes and a laugh that came easily. We talked about widowhood, about adult children who forget where they come from, about the quiet shock of realizing you've been taken for granted. Sitting there, mug warm between my hands, I felt understood without having to explain every detail. Shared experience does that. It smooths the sharp edges. At home, I made small upgrades. I installed a video doorbell, reviewed the footage myself, learned how to archive clips. I labeled file folders clearly. I kept a notebook by the phone and wrote down dates, times, summaries of calls. Not because I expected trouble, but because clarity feels like respect for your future self. One evening, as I watered the plants Harold loved, I caught my reflection in the window. Older, yes, lines deeper, but my eyes looked steadier, more present. I thought about how close I'd come to disappearing into usefulness, into being managed instead of living. Have you ever reached a point where you realized survival wasn't the same as dignity? Where simply enduring wasn't enough anymore? The repayments continued, consistent and documented. The trust paperwork was finalized. My lawyer congratulated me on being thorough. I thanked him, knowing thoroughness was something I'd always had, just rarely applied to myself. That night, I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders, listening to the neighborhood settle. Cars passed, lights clicked off. The house behind me stood solid, quiet, undeniably mine. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like something happening to me. It felt like something I was actively shaping, one careful choice at a time. Autumn arrived gently that year, the kind that doesn't announce itself with drama, but settles in through cooler mornings and the smell of leaves on sidewalks. I noticed it most in the quiet. The house no longer felt like it was bracing itself. It breathed again. I developed small rituals that belonged only to me. On Mondays, I paid bills at the dining table with a cup of tea and the radio low. On Wednesdays, I cooked something simple but deliberate, food that didn't need to impress anyone. I kept receipts clipped neatly and filed them the same day. Not because I feared losing control again, but because I respected the order it brought. The trust paperwork came back fully executed, thick with official stamps and careful language. I read every page slowly, not skimming a word. The house was protected now in a way that didn't rely on anyone's goodwill. I placed the documents in the red folder, then made copies for a small fireproof box I kept in the hall closet. Preparedness, I learned, is quieter than anxiety. It doesn't buzz, it hums. Daniel kept his distance. His payments arrived exactly as scheduled, always with the same neutral note. I could sense effort in that consistency. It told me he was learning something, even if it wasn't the lesson I once hoped to teach him gently. We spoke occasionally, briefly. Updates, logistics, nothing emotional. That space felt necessary, like letting a wound close without poking at it. Emily never contacted me again. I thought of her sometimes when I passed the school on Maple Avenue, kids spilling out with backpacks and loud confidence. I hoped she would grow into a version of herself that didn't confuse control with strength. That was all I allowed myself to hope. I volunteered one afternoon a week at the local library, helping sort donations and shelve returns. The work was quiet, repetitive, soothing. The librarian, a man named Thomas with thinning hair and a thoughtful manner, thanked me each time as if I were doing him a favor. Being appreciated without being needed felt surprisingly good. At the community center, Ruth and I became regulars at the same table. We shared lunches, sometimes silence. She talked about her sister's stubbornness. I talked about Harold's garden. We didn't pry into each other's pasts. Friendship at this age doesn't demand excavation. It just asks for presence. One morning, a letter arrived from the county confirming my eligibility for a senior property tax reduction. I had applied months earlier and forgotten about it. The approval lowered my annual obligation by enough to matter. I smiled at the letter, not because of the savings alone, but because it felt like the system, slow as it is, had noticed me. I took a short trip by myself in late October, just 2 nights at a lakeside inn an hour away. I packed lightly. I ate dinner alone in the restaurant without a book or phone, watching the water darken as the sun went down. No one rushed me. No one asked for anything. I slept deeply. When I returned, the house welcomed me the way it used to. I unpacked slowly, folded clothes, watered plants. Everything was where I had left it. Stability can feel luxurious when you've lived without it for a while. There were moments, of course, when sadness surfaced unexpectedly. A song on the radio, a phrase Harold used to say. Even Daniel's name on my phone could tighten something in my chest. But sadness no longer ruled the room. It passed through, acknowledged, and moved on. I realized one evening, while reviewing my checkbook and listening to the steady tick of the kitchen clock, that my life had grown quieter, not because it was emptier, but because it was finally aligned. Nothing was pulling at me from unseen corners. Nothing demanded I be smaller for the sake of peace. Outside, a wind moved through the trees, loosening the last stubborn leaves. I watched them fall without regret. Some things, once released, make room for a clearer view. Winter arrived without asking permission. One morning, I woke to frost feathering the edges of the windows. The street hushed as if the whole world had agreed to lower its voice. I wrapped myself in the thick cardigan Harold used to tease me about and stood at the kitchen sink, watching my breath cloud the glass. There was a time when winter made me uneasy, heating bills that jumped without warning, icy steps, the silence stretching too long into the evening. But this year felt different, planned, prepared, like I had already walked through it once in my mind. I had arranged things carefully in the weeks before the cold truly settled in. The furnace inspection was scheduled early, not because it had failed before, but because I wanted certainty. The technician handed me a printed report, all boxes checked, his signature clear at the bottom. I thanked him, closed the door, and filed the paper immediately. I no longer left important things sitting on counters, waiting to be misplaced by someone else. Everything had a home now. My utility accounts were aligned again. Statements arrived directly to me, both by mail and email. I set reminders on my phone and double-checked automatic drafts. I kept a handwritten ledger the way I always had, even though the numbers also lived safely in digital form. Redundancy, I learned, is not paranoia. It is peace. One afternoon, a certified letter arrived, the green slip folded neatly against the envelope. It was from Daniel's attorney. I sat down before opening it, something I'd learned to do when words might carry weight. The letter confirmed that the final repayment had been processed early, every dollar accounted for. No commentary, no explanations, just confirmation. I read it twice. Then I placed it on the table and rested my hands beside it. Closure, I discovered, doesn't always arrive with relief or triumph. Sometimes it comes quietly, like a door closing down the hall, leaving you alone with the sound of your own breathing. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I was finished. I walked the letter to the fireproof box in the hall closet, the one I'd bought after everything happened. Inside were deeds, trust documents, bank confirmations, police reports, mediation summaries. My life, reduced to poor but protected now. I placed the letter inside, closed the lid, and locked it. Then I stood there a moment longer, listening to the small click, knowing it was different from the sound of that changed lock months ago. This one belonged to me. The holidays approached in their usual, loud, insistent way. Store windows glowed with artificial warmth. Radio stations switched to songs I knew by heart, but hadn't chosen to hear. Invitations came from places I hadn't expected. Ruth asked if I wanted to join her and two friends for a modest dinner. The library organized a volunteer appreciation lunch with paper plates and overly sweet desserts. I accepted some invitations and declined others, choosing carefully, without guilt. That was new. On Christmas morning, I woke alone and content. I didn't rush. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching the pale light stretch across the street. I opened a single gift I'd bought for myself weeks earlier, a wool scarf in a deep green I'd admired but never justified before. I wrapped it around my neck and smiled at the woman reflected in the glass. She looked settled. I called a friend from my old neighborhood later that morning. We talked about nothing important, the weather, a television show, her grandson learning to drive. When we hung up, I realized how long it had been since a conversation hadn't required anything from me. No advice, no fixing, just presence. Late in December, the mediation office called for a routine follow-up. The woman on the line read from a checklist, her voice neutral and efficient. Were all terms satisfied? Yes. Any ongoing concerns? No. Would I like documentation mailed or emailed? Both, please. When the call ended, I sat quietly, thinking about how many people had touched my situation without ever fully knowing it. Clerks, officers, caseworkers, tellers, each one holding a small piece of my life steady simply by doing their job correctly. Systems can fail, but they can also protect when you step into them with clarity. As the year turned, I found myself in the basement sorting through boxes I hadn't opened since Harold died. Not because I had to, but because I finally could. Dust rose gently as I lifted lids. Inside were photographs, letters, old warranties, birthday cards Daniel wrote as a child in careful block letters. I didn't rush. I didn't throw things away in a fit of emotion. I organized them, labeled them, and returned what mattered to clean, dry storage. Memory, I realized, doesn't have to be clutter to be honored. January snow arrived steadily, transforming the street into something quieter and more forgiving. I learned a new rhythm of shoveling. Small sections, frequent breaks, respecting my body instead of pushing through pain the way I once had. Neighbors waved. One brought over soup without asking questions. I accepted it without explanation. Community doesn't demand stories. It offers warmth. On a particularly cold evening, the power flickered and went out entirely. Years ago, that would have sent my heart racing. This time, I moved calmly. I lit the lanterns I'd purchased months earlier, checked the breaker out of habit, and made soup on the gas stove. I wrapped myself in blankets and sat at the kitchen table, listening to the quiet hum of a world temporarily paused. When the lights came back on an hour later, I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let it linger. I thought then about how I had changed. Not hardened, not closed off, clearer. There is a difference. Hardness shuts doors out of fear. Clarity chooses when and how to open them. As winter deepened, so did my steadiness. I was no longer reacting to what had been done to me. I wasn't bracing for the next inconvenience or betrayal. I was simply living, deliberately inside a life that finally fit the shape of who I had become. By the time the days truly began to stretch again, when the light lingered just a little longer on the front steps in the evening, I understood that what I had lived through was no longer an active wound. It had become a scar, visible if you knew where to look, tender only when pressed, but no longer bleeding into everything else. That distinction mattered more than I expected. Spring came slowly that year, cautious and deliberate, much like I had become. The first thing I did was schedule the roof inspection Harold always handled without complaint. The contractor arrived right on time, clipboard tucked under his arm, boots carefully wiped on the mat. We sat at my kitchen table afterward, sunlight slanting across the wood, and went through his findings line by line. I asked him to explain things twice when I didn't understand. I didn't apologize for it. When he suggested upgrades that felt unnecessary, I declined without softening my voice or my reasoning. He nodded, adjusted the estimate, and treated my decision as final. That alone felt like a small victory. Once the paperwork was signed and filed, I turned my attention outside. The garden beds had been neglected, not because I didn't care, but because caring had once required energy I no longer had. I pulled weeds slowly, one by one, letting my body set the pace. The soil was cold at first, resistant, then gradually softened under my hands. Harold used to say the earth remembers who treats it kindly. As I worked, I thought about how true that was for people too. Neighbors passed and waved. Some stopped to chat. No one asked questions they didn't need answers to. The world didn't demand explanations from me anymore, and I realized how much of my earlier exhaustion had come from constantly justifying my existence. Now, I simply was. Inside the house, I continued refining the quiet systems that held my life together. I created binders, not out of fear, but clarity. One for finances, one for property, one for health. Each document scanned, labeled, and backed up. Originals stored safely. Emergency contacts updated. Instructions written clearly, not because I expected something to happen, but because preparedness is a kindness you extend to yourself and others. Daniel and I met one last time that spring, at his request. We chose a cafe neither of us had any history with, neutral ground. He arrived early and stood when I approached, unsure whether to hug me. I nodded and we sat. He spoke about work, about therapy, about learning what responsibility actually meant. He didn't minimize what he had done. He didn't dramatize it either. That restraint told me more than any apology could have. I told him I loved him. I also told him that love would no longer include access to my finances, my home, or my decision-making. He listened. He nodded. He didn't argue. When we parted, there were no promises of closeness, no dramatic reconciliations, just an understanding, sober and real. That was enough. Emily remained distant. I thought of her occasionally, especially when I saw teenagers laughing too loudly at the bus stop. I hoped she would grow into someone who understood the difference between convenience and care. That was all I allowed myself to hope. Carrying anything heavier would have weighed me down again. My days filled themselves naturally. The walking group at the community center became a fixture. Familiar faces turned into companions. Ruth and I shared lunches, sometimes talking, sometimes not. There was comfort in silence that didn't need filling. At the library, Thomas asked if I would help train new volunteers. I agreed, with clear boundaries, limited hours, defined responsibilities, mutual respect. He accepted without hesitation. Teaching others felt good, not because I was needed, but because I was valued. One afternoon, a woman came into the library looking overwhelmed, papers clutched tightly in her hands. She reminded me of myself months earlier, confused, uncertain, afraid of being dismissed. I helped her organize her documents, explained where to go next, wrote down phone numbers. As she thanked me, her voice shook slightly. I recognized that sound. It was the sound of someone standing on the edge of clarity. Watching her walk away, shoulders a little straighter, I felt something settle warmly in my chest. At home, I repainted the spare room, soft, neutral walls, new curtains that let the light in without exposing everything. That room had once held tension, unspoken expectations, the weight of being occupied by people who didn't see it as temporary. Now it was simply a room again, possibility instead of burden. I began attending a monthly financial literacy meeting for seniors. Not because I needed instruction, but reinforcement. We talked about scams, about estate planning, about protecting autonomy. When I shared parts of my experience, I stuck to facts. No names, no dramatics. Heads nodded, pens moved. Recognition passed quietly around the room. There was power in that shared understanding. There were still moments when memory surprised me. A receipt folded the wrong way. A voice on the radio that sounded like Daniel's when he was younger. A knock at the door that made my heart pause for half a second longer than necessary. But these moments passed. They no longer dictated my reactions. I acknowledged them and returned to the present. One evening, as daylight lingered and the air carried the faint smell of fresh-cut grass, I sat on the porch, watching shadows stretch across the lawn. The house behind me stood solid and calm. I thought about the woman I had been when that lock clicked shut, confused, hurt, uncertain of her own authority. I wished I could tell her what I knew now, that dignity isn't something others grant you. It's something you claim, slowly, patiently, one boundary at a time. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. My life wasn't larger than before. It was truer. And that truth had given me something no one could ever take away again. The day I finally felt free didn't arrive with fireworks or a dramatic phone call. It came on a plain Thursday in late spring, when the sun warmed the porch boards and the air smelled faintly of lilacs from Mrs. Donnelly's yard across the street. I stepped outside with my coffee and realized I had been standing in my own life again for months without flinching. I wasn't waiting for the next request, the next complaint, the next quiet takeover disguised as help. I was simply here, whole. That morning, I had an appointment at the county courthouse annex, not for a trial or a confrontation, but for a final notarization tied to the trust and updated beneficiaries. It was one of those small administrative steps that keeps your future from being rewritten by someone else's impulse. I wore my good coat not because it was necessary, but because I wanted to show up for myself with a certain respect. I locked my front door, listened to the clean click, and felt the difference in my chest. This lock did not hold me out. It held me safe. Inside the courthouse annex, everything sounded slightly amplified, shoes on tile, low voices behind glass windows, the soft thump of files being set down. I sat on a plastic chair and watched a young couple argue quietly over paperwork, watched an older man rub his forehead as he read a form too quickly printed. Everyone looked tired. Everyone looked like they were trying. It reminded me that life is full of moments where you either advocate for yourself or you disappear into the shuffle. When my number was called, I walked to the counter and slid my documents through the slot. The clerk, a woman with glasses hanging on a chain, scanned them carefully. She didn't rush. She didn't smile to soften the seriousness of her job. She simply did it correctly, and I found I appreciated that more than warmth. She asked for my identification. I handed it over. She compared my face to the photo, then to the papers, then back again. There was something oddly comforting about being verified, about having my identity confirmed by a system that didn't care about family dynamics or guilt or who was too much work. The system cared about names, signatures, dates, and consent. For once, that was exactly what I needed. The notary arrived, stamped, signed, and watched me sign with the kind of attentive neutrality that feels like respect. When it was done, she slid the papers back to me and said, "You're all set, Ms. Wilson." All set. Two small words that landed like a blessing. Outside, the wind was soft. I stood on the courthouse steps a moment longer than necessary, letting the light hit my face. Harold used to call moments like that quiet victories. He believed in celebrating what other people dismissed. A paid bill, a repaired hinge, a decision made without regret. I could almost hear him in the way the air moved, in the way the day held steady. On the drive home, I stopped at the bank, not because I had to, but because I wanted the final confirmation printed and placed in my red folder. I wanted the closing line under the story, the kind that can't be argued with later. The bank lobby was cool and smelled faintly of carpet cleaner. Sheila greeted me with that familiar practical kindness. "Margaret," she said, and there was relief in her voice too, like she had carried a small worry for me without announcing it. "I'm here for one last printout," I told her, and I heard myself smile. She nodded and led me to a desk, clicking through screens with practiced ease. "All repayments are complete," she said, turning the monitor slightly so I could see. "Account is clean, alerts are active, no external links except the ones you authorized." I stared at the screen. It was just data, numbers aligned, dates behaved, but my throat tightened anyway. Sheila printed the confirmation and stamped it, then handed it to me like it was something fragile. "You did the right thing," she said quietly. "Not everyone would have." I thought about that. The old version of me would have been embarrassed. She would have tried to soften the situation, protect Daniel from consequences, protect Emily from discomfort, protect the family story from cracks. She would have paid the hidden costs and called it love. The current version of me simply nodded. "Thank you," I said. "I'm trying to do the right thing for the rest of my life." On the way out, I noticed a brochure stand near the door, with information about financial abuse prevention and resources for seniors. A year ago, I would have walked past it, certain it wasn't meant for someone like me. Now I picked one up and slid it into my purse, not because I felt weak, but because I understood how strength works. Strength uses tools. Strength asks questions. Strength keeps receipts. When I got home, I placed the new papers in my red folder, then set the folder into the fireproof box and locked it. I stood there with my hand on the lid a moment longer than necessary. Then I let go, turned away, and went to the kitchen to make myself lunch. It was such an ordinary act. Tomato soup warmed on the stove, a grilled cheese sandwich, the bread buttered just enough to crisp. The kind of meal Harold and I used to eat when we didn't want to cook something proper. I ate at the table, not in front of the television, tasting each bite. Peace isn't a grand sensation. It's the ability to enjoy something simple without a knot in your stomach. That afternoon, Ruth came over with a bag of library books and a small pot of yellow flowers for my porch. She didn't knock timidly the way guests sometimes do when they aren't sure they belong. She knocked like a friend. When I opened the door, she held the flowers out with a grin. "For your victory season," she said. I laughed, surprised by how easily it came. "You make it sound like I'm winning something." "You are," she said, stepping inside and glancing around with approval. "You're winning your own life back." We sat on the porch with the books between us, talking about nothing urgent. The way the weather couldn't decide if it wanted to be warm yet. The new librarian intern, who shelved mystery novels in the romance section by accident. The neighbor's dog that barked at squirrels like it was his full-time job. Ruth told me about her grandson getting his first apartment and how she wanted to buy him a toaster, but didn't want to become the family's default emergency fund. I told her I understood. We talked about boundaries like they were normal, healthy things, like they weren't rude, like they were as necessary as locks and insurance. Later, when Ruth left, I went inside and stood in the quiet living room. The chair by the window was in its rightful place, the sunlight pooled on the rug, exactly where it always did in late afternoon. I thought about how, for so long, I had made myself small to avoid conflict. I had believed that if I stayed agreeable, I would stay loved. I had believed that being needed was the same as being valued. I walked upstairs to the spare room I had repainted. The curtains moved slightly in the breeze from the open window. The bedspread was smooth. The space felt light, not haunted by anyone's resentment. For the first time, I could imagine a guest here who was truly a guest, not a quiet occupier turning my generosity into entitlement. I could imagine hosting a friend for a weekend, or my niece if she ever visited, or no one at all. Choice. That was the point. Choice is a kind of freedom people don't talk about enough. In the early evening, my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen, and my body reacted before my mind did, the old reflex of bracing. Then I took a breath and answered calmly. "Hi, Mom," he said. His voice sounded careful, like he was walking across ice that might crack. "Hello, Daniel," I replied. He told me he'd received the confirmation that everything was paid. He asked if I got it too. I told him I had. He hesitated, then said he wanted to stop by sometime, just to talk. No agenda, he promised. He asked if that was possible. A year ago, my answer would have been automatic. Yes, come whenever you want. Stay as long as you need. Take what you want. I would have said yes out of fear that saying no would mean losing him forever. Now I paused, not to punish him, but to consult the truth inside myself. "You can visit," I said slowly, "but not unannounced and not inside the house yet. We can sit on the porch for an hour. That's what I can offer right now." There was a silence on the line. Then he exhaled, and I heard something like acceptance in it. "Okay," he said. "Thank you." After we hung up, I stared at the phone in my hand. My heart felt strange, tender and strong at the same time. I realized boundaries don't erase love. They reshape it into something that can survive. A week later, Daniel came. He arrived on time, which felt like its own kind of apology. He walked up the steps slowly, as if the house itself carried weight. I had already set 2 chairs on the porch, with a pitcher of iced tea sweating gently in the warmth. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, not in years, but in awareness. He sat down carefully and kept his hands folded, like he was trying not to touch anything that didn't belong to him. He told me about his work, about taking an extra shift to stay busy, about therapy sessions that made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't ignore. He admitted he had resented me for being stable when his life felt unstable. He said he had convinced himself he was entitled to manage me because he was overwhelmed and ashamed. I listened without interrupting. I didn't soften his words for him. I let him own them. When he finished, he looked at me with damp eyes and said, "I don't know how to make it right." I poured him tea and slid the glass toward him. The ice clinked softly. "You can't make the past right," I said, "but you can make your next choices different. You can learn the difference between needing help and taking control." He nodded, swallowing hard. I told him I didn't want to be his enemy. I told him I wouldn't carry that role, but I also told him the door to my life would open only as far as trust could reach, and trust would have to be earned slowly, through consistency, not promises. He didn't argue. He didn't ask for more. He simply sat there and accepted the limits, as if he finally understood that limits were not cruelty. They were reality. When he left, I watched his car disappear down Linden Street. I felt sad. Yes, because no mother wants a relationship with her child to require formal boundaries like a contract. But I also felt proud, not of him, not of myself in a bragging way, but of the moment, of the fact that we had spoken truth without collapsing into chaos. That is a kind of maturity family stories rarely show. That night, I slept deeply. In the weeks that followed, my life continued to expand in quiet directions. Ruth and I started taking short drives on Saturday mornings, just to see new neighborhoods, new little shops, places we had never bothered with when we were busy surviving other people's demands. We visited a small farmer's market and bought strawberries that tasted like sunshine. We sat on a bench and watched toddlers wobble across the grass, parents hovering with the same love and fear I remembered from decades ago. I felt tenderness for those younger versions of ourselves, trying so hard, believing love meant endless sacrifice. At the library, Thomas gave me a small thank you card signed by the volunteers I'd trained. Their handwriting was messy, sincere. One of them wrote, "You make things feel possible." I read that line twice and pressed the card flat in my palm. That was the kind of legacy I wanted now. Not martyrdom, not invisibility, possibility. Some evenings, I cooked for myself and ate with music playing softly. Other nights, I simply made toast and watched the sky turn dark from the porch. I learned that a peaceful life doesn't need constant proof. It doesn't need to be defended every day. It just needs to be tended, like a garden with steady attention and honest boundaries. And when I thought back to that afternoon with the groceries, the lock that wouldn't turn, the door closing gently, as if politeness could disguise cruelty, I didn't feel the same sting. I felt gratitude for the clarity it forced upon me. I would never have chosen that humiliation, but I could admit now that it saved me from a quieter, longer erasure. It pushed me to become the protector of my own life. Have you ever realized that the moment you were discarded was also the moment you were set free? I am 68 years old, and if I've learned anything worth keeping, it's this. Kindness without boundaries is not kindness. It's surrender. The truest form of love includes respect, and respect begins the moment you stop negotiating your own dignity. Thank you for staying with me through my story. If it moved you, please take a second to like and subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. If you were in my place, what would you have done?